Robert Duvall was sitting in the back of a university acting class when the professor asked the new student to introduce himself. What happened in the next 30 seconds left 22 students completely speechless. It was a Tuesday morning in February 1998, and the advanced scene study class at the University of Texas at Austin's Department of Theater and Dance was 7 weeks into the spring semester. The class met twice a week in a mid-sized studio rehearsal room on the third floor of the Winship Drama Building. Black walls, sprung hardwood floor, folding chairs arranged in a loose circle, the particular smell of a room that has absorbed decades of concentrated human effort. It held 22 graduate students, all of them serious, most of them talented, and all of them currently engaged in the specific anxiety of a semester-long scene work assignment that their professor, Dr. Margaret Voss, had structured with a deliberate and somewhat merciless attention to difficulty. Dr. Voss had been teaching graduate acting at UT Austin for 16 years. She had a reputation that extended well beyond the department. Directors who had worked with her former students described her training as the kind that shows up not in technique, but in instinct, in the quality of a performer's attention under pressure, in the ability to stay present when the scene is going wrong, rather than retreating to what is safe and rehearsed. She was not interested in producing actors who could demonstrate craft. She was interested in producing actors who could tell the truth under difficult conditions, which is a different and considerably harder thing. She was 61 years old, compact and direct, with the kind of professional authority that doesn't require volume to communicate itself. She had trained at the Juilliard School, worked professionally in New York and regional theater through the 70s and 80s, and had come to teaching not as a retreat from the industry, but as a considered decision about where her particular abilities could do the most good. Her students were afraid of her in the productive way, the way that makes people work harder than they thought they could. She did not recognize the man who slipped into the back of her classroom at 9:05 on that Tuesday morning in February. He was wearing a plain dark jacket and a baseball cap, and he had taken the last empty chair in the circle with the quiet efficiency of someone trying not to disrupt a class already in session. Several students noticed him and assumed he was a late-arriving classmate. 2 of them had never noticed him before and assumed he was someone they had simply failed to register over 7 weeks of twice-weekly meetings. One student, a second year named Rachel Kim, looked at him for a moment longer than the others and thought there was something familiar about his face that she couldn't place. And then the class resumed and she stopped thinking about it. The man in the baseball cap sat in his chair and watched the scene work with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who has nowhere else to be and finds the room genuinely interesting. Robert Duvall was 67 years old. He was in Austin for 4 days for reasons unrelated to the university. A meeting with a producer, a dinner with an old friend from his early New York days who had relocated to Texas years ago, and 2 days of the particular unstructured rest that he had learned over a long career to build deliberately into travel schedules, or it would not happen at all. He had been walking through the university campus on the morning of the second day because he liked university campuses, liked the quality of attention in the air around them, the sense of people in the middle of becoming something. When he had passed the Winship Drama Building, and, on an impulse that he would later describe simply as curiosity, walked in, he had followed the sound of voices to the third floor. The Winship Drama Building had the particular atmosphere that buildings given over entirely to a single art form develop over decades, something in the quality of the silence between the sounds, the way the hallways felt purposeful even when empty. He had been in dozens of buildings like it over the course of his life, starting with the neighborhood playhouse in New York in the early 1950s, and they all had this in common, the sense that the work happening inside them mattered to the people doing it in a way that exceeded the practical. He had always found this atmosphere more comfortable than most. The door to the advanced scene study room had been slightly ajar. He had knocked, looked in, and when Dr. Voss had glanced up and said, in the brisk way of someone mid-class who is willing to accommodate an interruption if it is brief, "Can I help you?" he had said. "I was hoping I might sit in for a while, if that's all right." Dr. Voss had looked at him for a moment. He was clearly not a student. He was clearly not faculty. He was wearing a baseball cap indoors, which was not a crime. "Take a seat," she had said, and returned to her students. The class had been running a scene from Sam Shepard's True West when Duvall arrived, and Dr. Voss finished it before doing anything else, which was characteristic of her, and which Duvall noted with approval. When the scene ended and the critique began, she turned to the stranger in the back row. "Since we have a visitor," she said, in the tone of someone who's about to do something pedagogically useful with an unexpected resource, "perhaps our guest would like to introduce himself and tell us why he's here." 22 graduate acting students turned to look at the man in the baseball cap. Duvall took off the cap. He looked around the circle at the 22 faces looking back at him. Then, he said, in the plain, conversational voice that had been one of the defining instruments of his 50-year career, "My name is Robert Duvall. I was walking past the building and I heard voices, and I came in." The room was absolutely silent for a moment. Then a student in the front of the circle, a tall second year from Ohio named Marcus Webb, said slowly and with the careful diction of a man who is not entirely sure the words he is forming are the right ones, "Robert Duvall, the actor?" "Yes," Duvall said. The silence returned, deeper this time. Several students later said that their first response was not excitement or awe, but a kind of suspended disbelief. The specific cognitive friction of a thing that is happening in front of you that your brain insists should not be possible in this room, in this city, on this ordinary Tuesday morning. One student, a first year from Georgia named Paul Strickland, said afterward that he had spent the first 30 seconds after the introduction trying to identify the specific Robert Duvall film he was misremembering and slowly understanding that he was not misremembering anything. Dr. Margaret Voss stood at the front of the circle and looked at Robert Duvall with an expression that her students had never seen on her face before. It lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then, something in her professional composure reasserted itself, and she said in a voice that was almost entirely steady, "Well, since you're here, would you like to work?" Duvall looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's why I came in." What happened over the following 2 hours became, among the 22 students who were present, one of those stories that gets told at every gathering of that cohort for the next 25 years, not because of what Duvall demonstrated, though what he demonstrated was extraordinary, but because of how he participated. He did not position himself as a master class. He did not arrive with observations prepared in advance or a philosophy he was looking for opportunities to deliver. He had walked into a room where work was being done, asked to be included in it, and been included. That was the entire arrangement, and he honored it with the straightforward seriousness of someone who understood that the most respectful thing you can do in another person's classroom is take it as seriously as they do. No more and no less than that. He did not offer unsolicited observations about technique or career or the industry. He took scene assignments from Dr. Voss the same way the students did, worked with scene partners he had never met, and submitted to the critique process with the same openness that was expected of everyone else in the room. The first scene he worked was a short piece from a Chekhov one-act, partnered with a first-year student named Diana Reyes, who was, by the account of everyone present, so overwhelmed by the situation that she could barely speak her first line. Duvall ran the scene anyway, and something in the quality of his attention to her, the way he listened to her lines as though they were the most important words currently being said anywhere in the world, seemed to steady her. By the third exchange, she was in the scene. By the end, she had forgotten, for stretches of 30 or 40 seconds at a time, who she was standing across from. This was the thing she talked about afterward when people asked her what it had been like, not the fact of working with Robert Duvall, but the specific experience of being so fully met in a scene that the person meeting you became, temporarily and completely, only the character they were playing. Dr. Voss gave notes. She gave them the way she always gave them, directly, specifically, without softening. She told Duvall that his first choice in the scene's central moment was too comfortable, that he had found the safe version of the emotion rather than the true one, and that the safe version was visible as such from the 4th row. The 22 students in the circle waited. Duvall nodded. "You're right," he said. "Can we run it again?" They ran it again. The second version was different in the way that mattered, not more effortful, not more demonstrative, but truer, in the specific sense that Dr. Voss had been trying to teach her students to understand all semester. She watched it with the attention she gave everything, and when it ended, she said, That's the scene, in the quiet voice she used when something had arrived at what it needed to be. Duvall nodded again. He sat back down. A student named James Okafor, a second year who had been in the program long enough to understand what he had just watched but not quite long enough to be certain he understood it correctly, raised his hand. "How do you know the difference?" he asked, "between the safe version and the true one?" In the moment, Duvall looked at him. "You don't always," he said. "Not while you're doing it. Sometimes the only way you know is that the other person in the scene changes. If they change, you found something real. If they stay the same, you showed them something." James Okafor wrote this down. Around him, several other students were writing too, not because Dr. Voss had asked them to, and not because it was the kind of observation that lends itself to being written down, but because they understood instinctively that they were in a moment where the thing being said had a density that ordinary listening might not fully preserve. A first-year student named Clara Hess, who had her notebook open on her lap, wrote the words, "If they change, you found something real," and drew a line under them twice. She still has the notebook. At 11:15, Dr. Voss called the end of class. Students began gathering their bags and scripts with the slightly dazed quality of people who are processing something they haven't finished processing yet. Duvall stood, put the baseball cap back on, and shook Dr. Voss's hand. "Thank you for letting me stay," he said. "Thank you for working," she said. She paused, which was uncharacteristic. "You took the note." "It was a good note," he said. He shook hands with Diana Reyes, who had run the Chekhov scene with him, and with James Okafor, who had asked the question. He nodded to the rest of the circle. Then he walked out of the studio, down 3 flights of stairs, and back into the February morning in Austin. Dr. Voss stood at the front of the empty room for a moment after he left. Then she sat down in the nearest folding chair, which was something her students had never seen her do mid-class or after it, and which Rachel Kim, who had been the last to leave and witnessed it from the doorway, later described as the most telling thing that happened all morning. The following Thursday, when the class met again, Dr. Voss did not mention what had happened on Tuesday. She ran the class exactly as she ran every class, with the same structure, the same demands, the same direct and unsparing attention to the work. Several students said later that this was, in its own way, the final lesson of the Tuesday session, that what had happened was not an interruption of the class, but a particularly clear instance of it, and that the appropriate response was to carry what it had shown them into the ordinary work rather than treat it as a story to be preserved separately from that work. Of the 22 students in that advanced scene study class, 7 went on to work professionally as actors. 3 of them have, at various points in interviews or panels, mentioned a morning in Austin when something they had been told about the difference between showing and being was demonstrated for them in a way that made it permanently clear. None of them have named the room or the university. The story, in their telling of it, doesn't need those details. It needs only this. A man walked into a class, sat down in the circle, took the same notes everyone else took, and when he was told his first choice was too safe, he said, "You're right," and ran the scene again. That was the whole lesson. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever watched someone genuinely great choose to be a student, subscribe, leave a comment, and hit the notification bell. More stories about the real character behind Hollywood's greatest legends are on the way every single week.